Welcome back. Now we're going to have some fun and talk about bargaining in Monopoly. Now, before, when we looked at a basic ultimatum game, we saw that a bargain was possible. And the reason that a bargain was possible is because a surplus existed. In other words, the buyer of the good valued it at a price higher than the seller of the good valued it at. And that's great. Life is awesome when surpluses exist, but sometimes they don't exist. And under those conditions, bargains just aren't possible, or they're completely pointless if a bargain is possible. And to see why this is the case, let's look at an example involving Monopoly. So let's think about a game where there are just two players left. At the end of the lecture, I'll talk about what happens when there are more than just two players left. But for now, just two players, and they're super intelligent. Okay? Now, under those conditions, think about this. What sorts of trades are possible? We have two players left. Either they started the game and they were the only two players in the game, or because they've eliminated everyone else in the game, we're down to just those two players. Think about what sorts of trades are possible. And if you want to, go ahead and write a comment in the comments section of this lecture. And once you've done that, I will now reveal the answer. And the answer is that no relevant trades are possible. And to understand why, what we're going to do here is first introduce a little bit of notation, then look at a simple bargaining version of this situation, and then show that, in fact, this answer is correct. So let's start with that notation here. We're going to let P be the probability that Albert wins. So at any given board state, we have a distribution of money, a distribution of property, a distribution of houses and hotels, and a distribution of get-out-of-jail-free cards. And essentially what you can do with all of that information is convert it into a probability of victory, where having more of that stuff is going to increase your probability of victory. So we're letting P represent that. So P is the probability that Albert wins in a game between just Albert and Barbara here. Now, because there are just two players left and because somebody has to win the game, that means the probability that Barbara wins can be written very simply. It's just 1 minus P. This comes from the fact that a two-player game of Monopoly is a zero-sum game. What that means is that any sort of gain for me is bad for you and vice versa. Another way to say a game is a zero-sum game is to say it's a strictly competitive game. Again, a gain for me is good for me and bad for you and vice versa. That's the sort of situation that we're looking at. And these sorts of games have some common elements, and that's what we're going to be looking at essentially here in this lecture when we get to the bargaining situation. Now, to talk about a proposal here, let X be the proposal that Albert is going to be offering to Barbara. And so X is just a simple redistribution of money, property, and get-out-of-jail-free cards, right? So I have some money and some property. You have some money, some property, maybe a get-out-of-jail-free card. I can offer you some amount of money, some amount of property, and perhaps a get-out-of-jail-free card that I own for your property and your money, right? It's very simple. That's what X is. X is just a proposed division of all of those good things that people want in a game of Monopoly. Now, because we can take any sort of board state and convert it into a probability of victory, we're going to let f of x be the function that does that. So f of x is a function that takes that proposed division x and turns it into a probability of victory if x is actually implemented. And again, because the situation is zero-sum, it's a strictly competitive game, that means the probability that Barbara wins the game under this new state of the world, x, is going to be the remainder of Albert's probability of victory, or 1 minus f of x. Okay? So those are the probabilities of victory if a trade occurs. Now let's think about this in terms of a simple ultimatum game. Later in this course on bargaining, we're going to be looking at situations where there are more complex sorts of bargaining environments, more complex bargaining protocols with a lot of counteroffers and so forth. Actually, doesn't matter if we look at a more complex version of this or a simple ultimatum version of this, we're going to get the same result. And that's kind of neat, because what I'm saying here is that we can look at a very simple game and without loss of generality say that the result will be exactly the same in these more complicated bargaining environments. So Albert here is just proposing a simple division, x, of the property and money and so forth, and Barbara either accepts it, implements it, and we get those new probabilities of victory determined by the function f of x, or she rejects it and we have our status quo probabilities of victory represented by p and 1 minus p. So I want to focus now on what Barbara is going to do here. When Barbara gets an offer, she can either accept or reject. And if we look at what her choices are here, if she accepts, she gets 1 minus f of x. If she rejects, she gets 1 minus p. So for Barbara to be willing to accept, it must be the case that her probability of victory under that new state of the world is at least as good as her probability of victory if she were to reject. In other words, 1 minus f of x has to be greater than or equal to 1 minus p. Well, if you do some simple simplification here, we get down to a statement that says that Barbara is willing to accept if f of x is less than or equal to p. That's what must be the case in order for Barbara to accept. F of x has to be less than or equal to p. Now, looking at the other side here, when is Albert wanting to get his offer accepted? Well, in order for him to actually want an offer to be accepted, it must be the case that f of x is greater than or equal to p. That's just simply right there on the screen in front of you. You don't even have to do any simplification there. So for Albert to actually want to get an offer accepted, he's got to put f of x higher than p, or at least as high as p. Otherwise, he would just want to offer something to Barbara that would definitely get rejected so he can maintain his current probability of victory. So these last two slides have given us constraints about when a bargain is possible, and Albert's constraint is that f of x has to be greater than or equal to p. Barbara's constraint is that f of x has to be less than or equal to p. So for a deal to be possible here, if you just look at those two inequalities, there can only be one sort of deal that allows a bargain to happen, and that's if and only if f of x is equal to p. But what that means is that the only trades that can happen in this game, when there's down to two players here, actually have no impact on the outcome of the game. The probability of victory after you accept is going to be identical to the probability of victory before you accept it. And the reason is that if there's any sort of change, then either Albert is not going to want to offer that change, or Barbara is not going to be willing to accept that change. So the moral of the story here is that if you're playing a game of Monopoly and someone better than you is offering you a trade when it's just down to two players, that's a trap, and that means you should be rejecting it. Now, I said, and this is the last thing we're going to do here, I said at the beginning of the lecture that we're going to be looking at what happens when there are three or more players here, and when that's the case, actually trades now become possible. And the reason is that it's not strictly competitive. The game is no longer strictly competitive between two players when there's a third player out there. And the reason for that is that that third player has a probability of victory himself. And so a trade between you and me can actually benefit the both of us by stealing away some of that probability of victory from the third party. And so you can think of a very simple example here. Imagine I own one orange property and two red properties, and you own two orange properties and one red property. Then we can trade an orange property for a red property and complete a monopoly for both of ourselves. And so maybe one of us will get a better end of the deal, and maybe one of us will get a worse end of the deal, but both of us are going to be better off because by having these really good monopolies on the really valuable properties, then what's going to happen is that probability of victory from that third player is going to be siphoned off away from him and toward both of us. So by taking and stealing away that probability of victory from that third player, we gain a surplus which can then be distributed between the two of us. So that's how bargaining works in Monopoly when there are two players, and also what happens when there are three players. Hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next time. Take care.